Good afternoon, everybody. Where we left off in the last part of our discussion was God's role in history, something that Horowitz emphasizes in his own way as much as Fackenheim, but with a different structure and a different emphasis. Basically, as I think we had suggested last time, God gives goodness its own power within history. God is not doing it all in a direct way, but in terms of what God stands for, what God endorses, what God asks of us, He gives these things the opportunity to help shape historical events and processes as well. He wants to accomplish a variety of things which he thinks have remarkable instances in history recording success in what God wishes to see accomplished in history. There's a very good example of this on page 152 of the text of Renewing the Covenant. And let me direct your attention to it as we look into the various components. We're reading the middle paragraph of 152, second paragraph on the page. For myself, that God redeems presently and ultimately has a theoretical and an experiential foundation. Knowing God to be good, if sometimes more inexplicably inert than active, and powerful, I trust that God's goodness will one day be fully manifest in creation. Before that ultimate day, of course, it may only be manifest in partial ways. He continues, I normally distrust beliefs derived logically from other beliefs unless they also have a basis in our living faith. I have been spared any deep experience of dark despair of which Buber speaks, and thus cannot truly attest to the experience of saving power that he wrote about. But I have known its analog in the hand that I have regularly discerned touching me and shaping my life in ways I cannot call my own, both conscious or unconscious. And I have experienced some great historic moments, and this is the point I think that is to be noted. I have experienced some great historic moments. The civil rights struggle of the early 1960s, the salvation of the Six-Day War, which he regarded as quite literally miraculous, and the liberation of communist Europe in 1990. These things that I knew to be shaped as much by God as by human agency. He concludes the paragraph with the simple statement, God redeems, meaning God really does redeem. So this becomes an important statement that is meant to vindicate his belief in God's role in history. One might observe that he chooses carefully what he thinks represents God's vindication in terms of the civil rights movement, in terms of the Six-Day War, and the dissolution of the communist state. There are other examples of momentous events in the 20th century, the late 20th century, that would challenge the notion that God's involvement is in any way consistent, and that there are developments that take place that are troublesome. Let's start with the Vietnam War and the loss of over 56,000 soldiers, and that's only on one side. How many civilians on the other side? And if all humanity is considered precious, soldiers on the opposite side too. One can also speak of the revolution in Iran which, like many other revolutions, took the lives of the well-intended and, on the whole, enlightened initial leadership. I'm thinking of many people who were consumed in the first years of the Iranian Revolution. Other examples would be the invasion of the United Arab Emirates. I may be mistaking the exact country right now. In the first Gulf War, the incomplete resolution of the Gulf War, the whole development of 9/11 and the aftermath, and the Iraq War and what's happened in Afghanistan. These are historical events too, and in some ways God is apparently quite silent or uninvolved, or at least we don't find theologians writing as Horowitz does here. So I would say that though one would want to make a case for God's involvement in history, it is going to be an ambiguous case at the very least, especially if one picks one's examples. Presumably, if it is to replicate in any sense the biblical teaching about God's involvement in history, God's involved in the unhappy news as well as the happy news. This brings us now to the notion that he develops regarding Israel, the people that creates the way of Torah, and in that sense makes revelation palpable, concrete, and something that can be learned from and acted upon. The most interesting and original thing that is presented is about Israel. And that is that Israel, the recipient of revelation, or what was originally known as the recipient of revelation, is actually the partner in the receiving and expression of revelation. Israel becomes a compound. It turns into self, on the one hand, referring to the individual self, and Israel referring to the collective of individuals who feel bound to each other by virtue of lineage, by virtue of shared experience in the present, by virtue of shared aspirations based on that experience, some of which is quite ordinary and some of which is absolutely extraordinary. And this is what we want to look at, because it's actually the most distinctive thing in Horowitz's entire teaching regarding the covenant. Israel is both the individual and the people, and please note, the individual first, the people secondarily. And that doesn't mean in terms of rank or value. It means that you start with the individual and you can make your way into something of greater significance once you have a people within which that individual can learn, function, and flourish. There is one text on page 155 of Renewing the Covenant that helps to express this, I think, rather effectively. And I wanted to call to your attention. Yes, it is the second paragraph on 155, the chapter being chapter 11, What Can We Do About Our Will to Do Evil? Any hope of creating a theology of the Jewish people must then first deal with the limits of individualism, and at least in my case, without substantially compromising what I acknowledge to be the religious, the religious truth of self-determination. Self-determination pertains here, at least so far as I can tell, initially and primarily to the individual. I propose to study the social side of individuality. See how individuality is there as the basis, and then we look at the sides of individuality. There's an individual side of it and a social side of it. Okay. So I propose to study the social side of individuality by looking at three of its critical aspects. In this chapter, I ask how self-reliant we can be, considering the self's propensity to do evil. In the next two chapters, I shall first examine the philosophical struggle over the social side of selfhood, and then whether humanity as a whole, rather than any lesser group, is our proper social matrix. Okay? So the point here is that the people who discuss Israel have traditionally started with the concept of the chosen people, or if not with the chosen people, at least with Jewish ethnicity. In other words, you start with the group. Eugene Borowitz, by contrast, starts with the individual as a basis for needing the people, or needing a people. The notion of the individual might be preserved so as not to compromise self-determination. And that, as we have now seen, he regards not simply as a secular value that became highly important during the time of the Enlightenment, both in France and in the United States and elsewhere, but as a value for the individual preeminently. So the notion of the individual is not meant to compromise. Pardon me. The notion of the individual must be preserved so as not to compromise self-determination. Nevertheless, the individual needs to recognize the limits of individualism. Why? Because just following one's own individual needs, wishes, aspirations can lead all too easily to a disregard of others, obviously, and the corruption of one's own self's desires into a propensity towards doing evil that is harming oneself, harming others, others known as individuals, and even harming the potentiality for a group to form and flourish. Whether the group is small in number, like the members of a family, or the group is much larger. Okay, that said, there is a secondary text here that develops the thought in a way that will become rather important for his argument as it unfolds. Turn, if you will, to page 181. Almost there. Yes. As the 20th century moves towards conclusion, I find much truth in Buber's obdurate individualism. So here you get a reaffirmation of the importance of individualism, now shared from the perspective of Buber. Again and again, in one place or another, people find it the height of moral responsibility to oppose the many social institutions that purport to benefit us, but then abuse or neutralize our freedom, that is to say, our individual freedom. By the way, I also wanted to comment that the Buberian emphasis on the individual is right there at the beginning of I and thou. It's I and thou, not we and thou. And the same applies even for I, it. The I is always the mark of the individual. He continues, that is to say, Borowitz does. To that extent, the Enlightenment's vision of ethical duty cannot be surrendered. In other words, as long as there is the potential for the abuse of individual freedom, the Enlightenment's vision of ethical duty cannot be surrendered. Nonetheless, I also do not see this as our paramount spiritual concern. One glance around us reveals that what was once the human liberation of an individualism that reason could be expected to socialize has, with the loss of the old qualitative certainties, degenerated into a threateningly amoral self-centeredness. In other words, what was originally self-evident in terms of individual rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which would have been entirely worthy and achievable because human reason would have dictated and caused us to think through with full awareness of consequences and impact of our choices on others as well as ourselves. When this discipline and a set of assumptions that would generate discipline would weaken over time, the result was a degeneration of personal autonomy into an amoral self-centeredness. If only to invest autonomy once again with the high dignity that entitles it to oppose insensitive institutions, we need to oppose irresponsible individualism. I suspect there's nothing really controversial about that, especially if you designate the individualism concerned as an irresponsible variety. So we need to oppose irresponsible individualism by specifying the sources of authority that should legitimately limit the exercise of the free self. In our time, re-socializing autonomy, making it responsible to larger groups of people, making it something that fits in with the needs of many, not simply the one, me and my wishes. In our time, re-socializing autonomy has become as important a moral imperative as opposing collectives seeking to deny it. Against Buber, we must re-emphasize the sociality of the individual self. Let me repeat that. Against Buber and his emphasis on I, thou, and I, it, we must re-emphasize the sociality of the individual self, that it takes in concerns regarding others. It looks for the company of others, and so on. Even as with him we envisage all human beings bound in a covenant with God. And so he goes on, this shift of priorities has even greater cogency for contemporary Jewry. We shall have no rich sense of Jewish duty as long as we persist in thinking of ourselves as individual selves in general, which was basically the Enlightenment view in the 18th century and early 19th century. So we should not persist in thinking of ourselves as individual selves in general, who see Torah as another resource, though an emotionally attractive one, for enhancing our high humanity. So what we really are, and only this, is individual human beings in general. This is something he wants to challenge. Only when we end the distinction between our personhood and our Jewishness and understand ourselves as indivisibly Jewish souls, highlight that, underline that, only when we see ourselves or understand ourselves as indivisibly Jewish selves, person whose selfhood is inextricable from their participation in the Jewish people and its historic relationship with God, will we make possible a vigorous postmodern life of Torah. So this is actually his innovation and one of the more important contributions of the entire book. And that is his conception not simply of an individual self in general, otherwise non-specific, and capable of becoming anything it wants, but that we are a Jewish self, and that already gives us certain kinds of orientations, concerns, sensitivities, and the like, that deserves development in its own right. It's not simply a little facet of our self in general. Okay, that said, we will continue with what follows, at least in his discussion of the matter. Now, in returning from our break, we can continue with what Borowitz does in developing this notion of the Jewish self. In chapter 13, which is entitled Fully Human, Fully Jewish, he proceeds to do so in a rather interesting way. Earlier, he had spoken of particularity and universality, and he does so here also, but he does it even more powerfully. Basically, Borowitz objects to the idea that Jewish particularity is merely a means to achieve universal ends. The reason he finds this objectionable is that it treats Jewish particularity, our distinct and unique identity, as something that is purely instrumental, and that as a result, the life of Torah and the study of Torah don't have any special value in and of themselves. It is only for the sake of achieving certain universal human goals that would be commended by everyone. But that is not the actual nature of what these activities, that is to say fulfillment of the mitzvot and the study of Torah, actually mean within Judaism. And therefore he wants to present Torah, and that is to say study and fulfillment, as having intrinsic value of their own and not being only instrumental. There's a good example of this that you can find on page 183. We need to begin, this is the last paragraph, we need to begin this enterprise by clarifying the worth we assign to Jewish particularity, for it will be a primary determinative of what we consider to be a satisfactory life of Torah. The possibility of the death or fossilization of our people poses the issue most starkly. Do we believe the Jews and Judaism to be ultimately dispensable or not? Would our disappearance from history be only another socio-cultural loss like that of the Carthaginians, or perhaps of the Incas, or would it constitute something far more irretrievable, a tragedy with cosmic reverberation, as it were? Practically, how much should we care if our grandchildren are being raised as decent human beings, but not as Jews? If Jewishness is only a matter of conditioning, personal emotion, or social habituation, our discomfort at our descendants not being Jewish would not really be understandable, but have little normative weight. If, however, and this is the important part, if, however, we believe that the Jewish people has a critical role in history, human history, namely bringing the Messiah, then staying Jewish and projecting Jewishness through future generations become critical Jewish responsibilities. I speak as one of those, I here of course meaning Eugene Borowitz, speak as one of those Jews whose religio-ethnic experience has disclosed a certain absoluteness in faithful Jewishness, one not derivative of anything but God's will and our answering dedication to that will. Though I shall return, he adds, to this issue in chapter 17, I will carry on my analysis here in terms of this strong affirmation of Jewish particularity. So we have a role, as far as he is concerned, not simply in serving general human interests and commending our unique expression, our unique cultural or even religious expression, general human values. It is the values within Judaism themselves that are precious and have something to teach humanity, not simply to be an instrument of realizing humanity's aspirations and goals. So, to carry this a little bit further, he speaks of the preciousness of Jewish particularity. It has its own intrinsic dignity. The The Columbus platform of the late 1930s subordinated particularity to realizing universal goals. But the San Francisco platform gives both Jewish particularity and universal human concerns equal and distinct status. So one is not an instrument to the other. Both have something to contribute to the other, but they are distinct and no one is given primary value. For Borowitz, living in covenant with God via the life of Torah is an end in itself. That is the key notion here. Living a life of Torah in covenant with God is an end in itself. 19th century Judaism overly instrumentalized Torah. If, however, you regard the Torah as an intrinsic value, you do not necessarily give up instrumentality altogether. You simply cease to subordinate it to other purposes, other ends that will be entirely universal. Nevertheless, however much he endorses Jewish particularity, there are different ways of expressing Jewish particularity. And the one that is most famous, that will come immediately to mind to all of you simply by how we recite the first blessing of any aliyah we are honored to have when called to the Torah, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amin, we will immediately recognize that the notion of chosenness has been the first and foremost means of expressing Jewish particularity. But Eugene Borowitz is actually uncomfortable with the notion of chosenness. What he prefers in place of chosenness, and it is equally natural and appropriate to defining Jewish identity, is simply the notion of covenant. He truly does make it central on many, many counts and in response to many, many questions. A good example of this you can find on page 211. This is in the middle of the page, near the end of the first full paragraph on the page. I believe we must supplement human choosing with God's own action if we are to explain to ourselves our fundamental commitment to the continuity of the people Israel. And what is God's own action that is of importance here? He would not express it as a matter of choosing Israel. It would be expressed in God's entering into a covenant with Israel. Can other peoples be chosen? Well, yes, for different purposes, with different roles. God certainly redeems other people. That's mentioned in the book of Amos, and I think we've even referred to it before. Bringing the Philistines from Kaftor and the Syrians from Kir, of course. In any event, he goes on to say, yet I believe the traditional view that God chose us from among all peoples and gave us the Torah clashes too much with our sense of history and reality for us to reaffirm it. So he's not interested in reaffirming chosenness as such. He does not specify here what it means when he says it clashes with our sense of history and reality. And I suspect one of these considerations is the familiar problem of regarding one's Jewish identity as promoting one to a superior position vis-a-vis all other peoples. And that is the one that is most problematic, even for that matter, to the prophets. Again, Amos is very, very important here in expressing the challenge to that, at least in biblical sources, because in mentioning God's bringing the Syrians from Kir and the Philistines from Kaftor, redeeming them also, his response to what he did likewise for the children of Israel is that I will visit all of your sins upon you. So what's crucial? Not your status, but whether you kept the terms of the covenant. That's what's central. That's what's crucial. And while Borowitz does not make specific reference to this, I think that is the foundation, or at least the earliest foundation, on which he bases his choice. There are certainly intervening ones, and he's especially noting in the paragraph we read more modern considerations, probably along the lines of the equality of peoples in worth and value to God. That said, let's go a little bit further. Chosenness lacks mutuality, but covenant preserves mutuality. God has a wish to be in joint association with the people of Israel. The people of Israel comes to have a wish to be in joint association, otherwise known as shutafut, partnership, with God. That's mutuality, and mutuality for a common purpose. The need, therefore, to supplement human choosing with God's choosing is rather central for him. For that reason, Borowitz, that is, criticizes Heschel for basically understanding the covenant in terms of simply the demand for Israel's obedience. This is expressed on page 211 also, but somewhat after the paragraph that we read. He says here, this explains to me why, for all the veneration American Jews have lavished on Abraham Heschel, his treatment of the Jewish people's special character has had little resonance. Heschel asserted his God-centered view, the sharp contrast with Mordecai Kaplan's humanism, as a simple consequence of the reality of revelation. God's never repeated act at Sinai turned the escaping Hebrew slaves into God's chosen people and set them apart from all other peoples to serve God in special devotion. That is the Kaplan position. Heschel balanced this neo-traditionalism by arguing that Judaism contains far more human interpretation than divine revelation, and that the law functioned as a personal spiritual way to God's presence. Nonetheless, once he made the incomparably transcendent God the authority behind the oral and written Torah, obedience became the leading motif of Jewish piety. So when all things are taken into account in Heschel, the covenant means not mutuality, but you, Israel, have to obey. That's what it's all about. This is what he finds objectionable, even amongst a modern way of interpreting Torah, and therefore he wants to emphasize covenant in a different way, and that is where the element of mutuality takes precedence for him. Okay? He loves also the notion of enhanced reciprocity, which parallels Buberian themes we've already looked at. Here, he argues for a covenant in personalistic terms. The people's side is enhanced by covenant, and God's side is likewise enhanced by covenant. Trouble with chosenness is that it places the initiative and too much of the weight on God's side, and that is why he rejects it. Now, let's carry this a little bit further. How does he deal with Jewish selfhood? We have another text here that will be helpful to consider. It's on page 214. And it reads as follows. This is the bottom paragraph under the subheading, Toward a Jewish Selfhood. We shall not arrive at a theory of robust Jewish duty, robust meaning vigorous, strong, active, as long as we do not transform the Enlightenment's self into a Jewish self. Remember, the Enlightenment's conception of self was of a rational self representing all humanity. So all human beings, insofar as they are rational and capable of reflecting on principles that can be studied and listening to others and what principles they articulate, that they can come together on issues that are of self-evident value. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if one is taking an American formulation of this, liberty, equality, fraternity, the categorical imperative, if one is following Kant, and the like. Okay? So what does he add to this? The kind of person I contend our religious experience has shown many of us are, is people with a robust sense of Jewish duty. So he goes on, as I reached this understanding of our problem, the notion of covenant as relationship, and that probably here means mutual relationship, appeared to me to open a way towards its solution. It provided me with a metaphor keyed to the involvement of the whole self, yet pointing to the priority of the Jewish people in our relationship with God. The covenant being made with the folk, meaning the group, as a whole, not with Jews as isolates. Okay, so the covenant involves and is meant to involve the individual Jewish self, the kind of self that has been already described as self-determining, freely choosing. But what actually makes the covenant possible is that it's not with one individual after another, or a lot of individuals at the same time, but with individuals who have come together to see themselves as part of a common enterprise, a common aspiration, and therefore having an identity defined by the covenant itself. Okay? That is what he is leading to in this passage. And this is what points to the sociality of the self. This understanding of the sociality of the self explains how one of our major societal ills, privatism, and its associated loneliness, depression, etc., intellectually derives from taking persons atomistically rather than as intrinsically social. The same is true in the Jewish community. The theological root of Jewish non-observance is the doctrine that we are persons in general who just happen to be Jews. But if Jewish particularity does not require external legitimation and has a self-validating quality, theologies built on the primacy of universal selfhood can never give adequate dignity to being one of Israel. Okay, so the crucial part, and this is where he concludes it, where the self in general finds its ground in the Noahide covenant with God, the Jewish self has its roots in the Jewish people's historic covenant and relationship with God. The covenant-Jew is no schizoid person in general who incidentally gratefully participates in Jewish ethnicity, but a Jew/person at once in utter existential depth. And what does this create? It creates a basis for duty. Okay? Near the end of the middle paragraph on page 215, he goes on, Jews living as part of a community bound today, as for millennia, in a true relationship with God, will find their individual responsibilities arising from being commanded as part of our personal, yet folk, meaning people's intimacy with God. God's quality exalts the relationship, making its entailments compelling. In other words, if it was simply a group preference, yes, you could stir up a lot of enthusiasm. You might be able to get a lot of discipline depending on how tightly the members of the group are bound together. But that doesn't provide exaltation. And I don't mean by exaltation, and I don't think he means by exaltation, a sense of ecstasy. What he means by exaltation is something of high moral worth. And that is provided by the participation of God and all that God represents. So much then for the weight that is added by God's participation in the covenant. One possible objection that has been raised against what he maintains is that the problem of chosenness that he chooses to dispense with, which might lead towards a sense of personal exaltation for the people, this might be eliminated simply by saying it represents God's side of the covenant. God has to enter into a covenant with someone, and whoever God chooses, in terms of this covenant, there may be other kinds of covenants with other kinds of people, just as there are other redemptions for other kinds of people. This covenant is the one that represents God's choice of us. No special status of exaltation. We are expected to meet the requirements, and we can argue with God wherever God's participation isn't what it should be. Okay. Now, one of the interesting things about this notion, particularly in terms of being at one and the same time, human and Jewish, and that these two link together to create the basis for the covenantal relationship, is that we have here a parallel, a rather interesting parallel for a Reform rabbi and Reform Jew, with a concept that you may be familiar with from early modern Orthodoxy and the work of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in the first half of the 19th century, because he has the concept of the Yisroel Mensch, which is the Israelite / human being. And it is the basis for his notion of Torah im derech eretz. As Yisroel, one has special obligations to be observant of and fulfilling with regard to the mandates of the Torah. And as a mensch, one can appreciate both the value of everything the